So the first book I read since our last book club was Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And this book is notable for its connection to the Mother series in that the aliens from this, the Tralfamadorians, which are these weird green beings that have like hand bodies, and they're also half toilet plunger, which is called a plumber's friend in the book. And in the center of their sort of hand head is a single eye. It's very bizarre, and they speak very oddly, and they have their own sayings. They say "so it goes" whenever somebody dies, which is something I quote quite a bit from this book. And they actually kidnap slash abduct the main character, Billy Pilgrim, and put him into their human zoo. It's very interesting. And they were actually the inspiration, or at least like half the inspiration, for the Mr. Saturns and EarthBound, because of their just weird, quirky nature of being weird aliens. And as most people know, the other half of what makes Mr. Saturn are the weird font they speak in whenever they're speaking, and it's actually based on the handwriting of a toy's 3-year-old daughter at the time, though it was a toy who actually designed the font. I really enjoyed this book, and I'll definitely be reading it again. It was one that I had to read in high school, but had zero appreciation for, because in high school they make you read all these books you couldn't really appreciate in the time they make you read them, and revisiting them the last few months has been really great. Like earlier this year I reread The Great Gatsby and stuff. I'm really enjoying these books now that I just am able to have a greater appreciation. And I've really come to really like Kurt Vonnegut as a writer. I know he's one of Atoy's favorite writers. He really loved his book Sirens of Titan, which is another one I'd like to read at some point. And there's also a 70s movie based on this book that I've heard is really good, and I heard Vonnegut actually really loved. And I actually checked out from the library recently, so I'll let you guys know what I think of that next time probably. The book's very well balanced dramatically and comedically. Overall, though, it's a pretty funny book, and I really enjoyed it, and I think it really is well structured for the type of story it's trying to tell, which is one of someone suffering from PTSD and other forms of shell shock after World War II, and the form of this funny science fiction time travel story. I would highly recommend this. This was one of my favorite reads since the last time. The next book I read was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, one I'd been wanting to get around to for a long time, and I actually haven't read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, though from what I understand that one's more of just a children's adventure book, while this one, total tonal whiplash, is like this hardcore allegory for prejudice. And I really enjoyed it. I didn't love it as much as I was hoping, but I did like it. It's, again, a book that's very well balanced in terms of comedy and drama. Particularly the comedy is really good in this. Mark Twain was a humorist after all. I really like a scene towards the beginning of the book where Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn meet up in the middle of the night with their friends, and they're all getting into an argument about this gang they're trying to start because Huckleberry doesn't have family to be killed in case he betrays them. It's very funny. This book's not very long, it's only a couple hundred pages, and I know a lot of people get turned off from reading it because of the southern dialect it's written in, but if you go in knowing that's what it is, you can figure out most of the things. It doesn't really demand homework of you to read up on the dialect and everything. Next, I read Watership Down by Richard Adams, which was one of my lesser favorite reads this month, unfortunately. It was a very long book. It's a little over 400 pages. It's close to 500. And it's like The Odyssey, but with rabbits. There's a famous 70s animated film, which is very good if you ever get a chance to check it out. And I'm surprised they were able to fit like so much of the core story into literally a 70-minute film. This one just felt kind of like a slog at some points, and admittedly I did have to switch to an audiobook like halfway through because I knew I was never going to be able to finish it otherwise because it was taking me so long. One of my lesser favorite reads this month, which is disappointing because it was one I really wanted to like, and it's not poorly written or anything. It's just, it feels like a bit of a slog sometimes because it gets so wordy at points. It feels constantly like start and stop with it. My favorite part of the book is probably the first part, and I also quite enjoyed the fourth and final part, or was it the fifth? I can't remember. If you're really into like war and adventure stuff, like you might like this, so I can give it a modest recommendation. It wasn't one of my favorites though. After that, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, who's one of my favorite writers. He wrote a play that's very hilarious called The Importance of Being Earnest, which there's a pretty good film adaptation of from the 1950s, though I would highly recommend watching a stage production. It's hilarious. It's one of my favorite plays ever, and it just changed my life when I saw it. It's very farcical, but The Picture of Dorian Gray is much darker than that. It's the only novel he ever wrote, as far as I know, and it's quite fun, actually. I enjoyed the second half much more than the first half, but at broad strokes, I enjoyed the story and themes and stuff. It's about a young man named Dorian Gray who's very attractive and has a painting of him by a painter friend of his. that he really admires, and unknowingly makes a deal with the devil that the painting will age as opposed to him, and it's about him dealing with the consequences of that and the mental anguish it takes on him. Like The Importance of Being Earnest, this also has a pretty good film adaptation from the 1940s, which, again, at broad strokes, gets things right. Unfortunately, not one of my favorite reads from this past couple months, but I can, again, mildly recommend it because it's not very long. It's maybe 230 pages, depending on the print you get. After that, I read 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger, which was a collection of short stories by J.D. Salinger, who wrote one of my favorite books of all time, The Catcher in the Rye. I believe this was his book he published right before Catcher in the Rye. And I gotta say, I was disappointed that I only really enjoyed about half of these 9 stories, maybe 4 of them or so. They're not poorly written or anything, they just didn't engage me about half the time. Something I really liked about the book is that it has a very consistent bittersweetness felt throughout the entire thing, which that's the kind of feeling I love in art. If you're curious, my favorite short stories from this were A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, The Laughing Man, For Esme with Love and Squalor, and Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes. And of course, how could I forget the short story Teddy Baby? And of those 4 I listed, Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes was probably my favorite of the entire book. Close to A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, though. And finally, the most recent book I completed was The Hobbit, or There and Back Again by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is my first time ever reading any Tolkien, and really diving into the fantasy genre, and this is one I was interested in reading just because it's so foundational for modern fantasy as well as high fantasy. And honestly, that was a lot of the stuff I really liked about this book, how foundational it was, and its overall just whole feeling. Like, reading this book on its own without any other Lord of the Rings books or Middle-earth books, it feels very complete. And I also appreciate that it doesn't demand homework of you to study everything about the world before you read it, because that's what turned me off to Middle-earth stuff for a long time, as well as stuff like Star Wars, is I thought that you needed to understand everything going in, and that's just not the case. This really isn't about, like learning about the world. It's more taking you a tour through it, and very naturally and organically teaches you about it. And honestly, I'm not going to promise anything, but it actually made me interested in reading the Lord of the Rings books, which I might do, at least Fellowship. Outside of this book, I actually have only seen the first Lord of the Rings movie, and as far as Middle-earth stuff goes, that's all I've consumed. So who knows, reading those might just be a good education on it, and, I might enjoy them before seeing the films at some point. I watched the 1970s Rankin and Bass Hobbit TV movie, and I enjoyed that quite a bit. It's not perfect, but it's pretty charming, and I do intend on seeing the Peter Jackson Hobbit films at some point, though I know those have pretty mixed critical reception. Anyway, that's all for all I've read. If you're interested, the next book I will be reading is, finally, this is the big one, guys. We're going to be reading the EarthBound Beginnings / Mother novelization by Kumi Saori, and I will be reading the fan translation, which I will link in the description. Outside of the Mother novelization, though, I will also be reading To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And finally, if you're really into this, the next 2 books I will be immediately reading are Breakfast of Champions and Welcome to the Monkey House, both by Vonnegut. Thanks for watching, guys, and remember, you can actually download and print out your own Monkey Nest official bookmarks if you want at the link in the description below, and I'll see you guys next time. Monkey out!